welcome back to our first afternoon talk today, and I'm delighted to welcome Richard Francis Jones, who is a frequent attender at WAF, has been to most of the events since 28, but in particular in 2013 he won the Building of the Year with the Auckland Art Gallery in New Zealand. Now, despite that building in New Zealand, he actually practices in Sydney, Australia, and very rarely for an architectural practitioner, he has written a book of essays called Truth and Lies in Architecture. And as we were talking just now, I said, generally when I see the words truth and architecture together, I think of the great 19th century critic John Ruskin. And we agreed this is probably the first book about truth in architecture that doesn't reference Ruskin, which many people would think is a great advantage. Anyway, the book emerged during the enforced idleness, or at least the lockdown over COVID, during COVID. And I think it's interesting that against that pretty ghastly backdrop of the loss of social and to some extent economic contact, that people are actually turning to use their brains in a slightly different way. Now, in a foreword to the book, the historian and critic Kenneth Frampton points out that this is unusual, a very unusual thing for a practicing architect to do. And I think it's also unusual in being perceptive and in using the format of the essay, which I think is something that is greatly misunderstood. A review of a building in a magazine is not necessarily an essay. An essay is about trying to present an idea and tease it out, but without the obligation you have in academic writing to put references to every single source that you've used. And therefore it can be both freer, but also to work, there has to be a sort of internal coherence and discipline to it. And I think that's what Richard's book, to me, and I have to confess I haven't read every essay, I'm afraid, but the ones I have do have that sort of sense of the form of the essay. So I think it'll be very interesting to hear how he's going to expand that in the talk. Richard.
Thank you. So, Truth and Lies in Architecture. So as Jeremy says, this is a collection of essays, and I'm going to give you a little sample this afternoon, in particular the prologue, and then also the title track, Truth and Lies. So this is an image of Marnpool and Maroubra, and this is part of the coastal lands of Sydney, which are from the Bidgal and the Gadigal people, and I would like to acknowledge them as traditional custodians of our lands. So 2 parts. Part 1, the melancholy of the architect. Melancholy is sadness that has taken on lightness. It's difficult to think deeply about architecture without a kind of sadness born of the relation between the magnitude of the task and the relative helplessness of the architect. The gravity of the task seems overwhelming for architects of our time. The looming environmental catastrophe of climate change and species extinction, the injustice and cruelty of socially and politically embedded inequity, prejudice and oppression, the reduction of our work to image, to a commodity, and our own cultural alienation and disconnection from a relationship that's authentic with the place in which we build and indeed with each other. We only manage to cope, it seems, through the distraction of hyperconsumption, media information technology that feeds our own individual truths, and the noisy illusion of a marginal democratic participation. If we do stop for a moment and reflect on the work of the architect within the vortex of this distress, self-obsession and distraction, then we may conclude that we are really just part of the problem. If we knock down an existing building and rebuild a new, sustainable, highly performing one, then it will still take many years before we offset the embodied carbon cost of the new build. If we start with an unbuilt site, then what costs the loss of green footprint, damage to the landscape, or indeed flattening effect on the specificity and identity of place that usually results? In any event, we are all too usually overwhelmed by the proliferation of images driving an incessant updating of self-conscious architectural fashion that demands a seemingly senseless rate of energy consumption and carbon generation to even notice. We might, with some justification, think that we are indeed part of the problem, and the best thing we can do is stop these new buildings, stop the production of beguiling new images, and take a break. Go on sabbatical, maybe. But we are trapped. We cannot stop nor turn back. The process of growth and the rapid and intense rate of urbanization is unstoppable. This is not going to stop for the architect to reconsider the direction of our work and industry, let alone try and turn its course. It is well beyond our control. No wonder when the architect pauses, turns off the phone, silences the alerts that remind us that we're behind, overdue, and out of date, then turns off all the tablets and screens that stream conscious entertainment and distraction. After a moment of peace, it is a mist of melancholy that descends. What is this sense of sadness? Where does it come from? Is it simply a rational reaction to the impossibility of the task, or is it something in the nature of the architect? Maybe something in our training or professional culture? There's a duality to the culture of architecture and the training of the architect. Perhaps born of the inherent duality of the nature of our work, positioned between science and art, between the measurable and immeasurable, function and form, practice and theory, and perhaps most relevant, between optimism and pessimism, the positive and the negative. To project into the future a vision that binds people together to the extent that aspirations can be realized, notwithstanding the great threats and challenges of the processes of construction, requires positive belief and real optimism. Approval processes, client and stakeholder consultation, technical challenges and limitations, time and cost pressure, all will threaten to compromise and dilute the vision of the architect. The architect must be the champion of the project, ready to listen and understand and constantly look to improve and refine rather than compromise. Above all, the architect must believe these hurdles can be overcome, spread the belief that something good and noble can be achieved. Architects are then by necessity and nature positive, supportive and optimistic. But there seems to be a flip side to the character of the architect. Architects are also pretty negative, particularly in relation to each other. We are really hard on our professional colleagues, quick to criticize and denigrate, and generally keen to focus on the faults and weaknesses. Is it because we have just exhausted our positivity through the constant projection of optimism that our work demands? Is there some kind of inevitable rebalancing of yang to an overplayed yin? Or is it the brutality of the industry that has done this to us? Is it because we have somehow been so traumatized by the stress and pressures of our professional lives that we have developed a paranoid and disorientated view of our colleagues when the real threats are elsewhere? More likely, it is born of our training, and in particular, the predominance of the negative critique in our schools of architecture. The negative critique seems to be a foundation for the education of the architect, reaching a focus in the jury criticism of major projects, often with external jurors, where the student is expected to present and then defend the proposition. The language seems needlessly negative and combative, more suited to the courtroom setting and the trial of an accused. What qualities does this process reward and engender in the student of architecture? How much creative talent, sensitivity, and potential is rejected and crushed? Why is there not a more nurturing, supportive, and encouraging culture of learning? Is it of a single-minded and self-perpetuating view that it is very tough in this industry and you better toughen up. The extent of this professional culture of negativity is a burden for the architect, but equally challenging for the architect and any would-be agent of creative change, innovation and optimism is an all more pervasive human bias towards negativity. This is the imbalance or asymmetry in the way we attend to and focus on the negative rather than the positive information and in events and news around the world. Seen through a broad range of psychological research, it seems clear that from early childhood we bias the negative. It focuses our attention and will mark our memory and figure in our thinking and actions notably more than the positive, which is all too easily overlooked and obscured. While there would seem to be an understandable evolutionary rationale to such prioritizing, in our contemporary lives and challenges, such negative prioritizing makes less sense. In many ways, this bias works against our interest. It is shaping our perspectives and actions with inaccuracy. The negative is a magnet for our attention. Hence, for example, the asymmetry in our news and media. And this negative imbalance is only intensifying through contemporary information technology and social media. Our professional culture and the natural human bias seem to result in two different responses from the architect. A kind of reactionary embrace characterized by overconfidence and self-righteous self-belief in the wake of success, or a deeper realization and understanding, perhaps intuitive, of the nature of the task, its complexity and vastness in relation to the trivial self-reference that engenders a profound sense of melancholy. Melancholy is beyond the dichotomy between the positive and negative. It is a state of recognition and acknowledgement of the human struggle with the way of the world, or more accurately, with our way of the world. It is at neither of the poles of optimism nor pessimism, but in today's circumstances can only truly be an experience of some sadness. Generally in our community, we think of melancholia as synonymous with depression, a debilitating mental health disorder of persistent sadness and demotivation to be treated with medication to correct the chemical imbalance that is giving us a distorted perception of the world and our place in it. People with this condition generally slow right down, slow their movements, slow their speech, and perhaps even their thoughts. They withdraw from a world that seems to have no place for them, a world deaf to their silence. If we hold back the beguiling, intensifying, and distractions of contemporary life, this sense of melancholia may seem a natural and inevitable reaction to our modern alienation, disconnection, and placelessness, where grasping for slowness and silence may make sense and even hold some promise of truth. This is perhaps closer to what we know as the artistic sense of melancholia, expressed by writers and artists from the early modern period. In the 16th century, the work of Giorgio Vasari suggested that a special artistic insight is gained through this state of mind. We often see that the exercise of letters and of the intellectual come manual arts, those who are melancholic are more assiduous in their studies and support with greater patience the weight of their labours, and hence it is rare for those of this humour to not achieve excellence. Beginning perhaps with Albrecht Dührer's famous allegorical woodcut Melancholia I from 1514, artists through to our modern period have represented this state of melancholy as a pensive figure, despondent, sober, head in hands, thoughtful and lost. But no matter the artist, each of these figures of melancholy has a penetrating gaze, is looking out into the middle distance, is searching for a way through the malaise. Perhaps melancholia is a necessary ingredient to the creative act of any depth. Perhaps artistic truth of consequence must be born out of sadness and doubt, born from reflection and thoughtfulness, from slowness and a withdrawal of the self. Today is surely not the time for the loud overconfidence of dominating master architects. Those times and what they have delivered, good and bad, have passed. The complexity and nature of the challenges we now face seem to require the pensiveness and sensitivity of melancholia. We are now less certain, more circumspect. We must know that mere appearance and image is not enough. All we have is the wisdom of doubt and melancholy, which might ultimately be worth more. The melancholy of the architect may be the only true and authentic place from which we can begin to work within the vexed conditions of contemporary life. The architect can start here. Perhaps this is the shore from which our projects can be launched. Part 2, the truth of architecture and the lies of the architect. Truth is like poetry, and most people fucking hate poetry. It's a quote from The Big Short, film from 2015. Truth and lies. The concept of truth is a perennial and vexed issue for architecture. Can architecture lay any claim to truth? Can architecture have a moral effect or purpose? Or is architecture indifferent to the intentions of its makers and the actions it accommodates? At this moment, when we are surrounded by so much noise, polarization, argument, and intolerance, questions of fact and accuracy, let alone truth, are suppressed, obscured, buried, or most worryingly, even irrelevant. We are now living and working as architects in the era of post-truth. The word post-truth was first used in 1992, but is only in 2016, coincidentally the year of Donald Trump's election to the US presidency, that it has become commonplace and generally now understood to refer to the shaping of public opinion through emotive appeals to personal beliefs, rather than objective facts. These appeals have been enhanced and amplified through the dominance of social media, which tends to equalize source legitimacy. Volume and frequency of repetition have become key validations over measurable or scientific data. We seek views and opinions that reinforce our own, rather than search for something approaching the truth. Post-truth has now become a numbing and exhausting contagion within our political and community discourse, which for those not located at the extremes engenders fatigue and apathy, further alienating us from any real interest in truth. Architecture is naturally infected with this bending and distortion of community and cultural discourse. But this is not the only distortion of any conceptual search for truth. Drawing on developments in digital effects in filmmaking and gaming, image production in architecture has become highly advanced and ubiquitous, with consumption and even valuation of architecture based on it. It is through the digital lens that we now see architecture. While the photographic image of architecture has been a dominant throughout the 20th century, the fabricated digital image is now not only hegemonic, but it has become difficult to distinguish between a photograph of a constructed building and the computer-generated image. So developed is the quality of digital image production. Similar and related developments in material technology have produced a wide range of synthetic materials that have overcome many of the performance limitations of natural materials, improved durability, decay resistance, thermal movement, recycling and waterproofness. But more disturbingly, many of these synthetics have carefully engineered appearances that closely simulate natural materials. For example, a synthetic composite porcelain panel can now be almost impossible to distinguish in appearance from a slab of natural Carrara marble. These advances offer alternatives and opportunities for the composition and performance of our work, but they're also a little disorientating. There can be a certain feeling of loss, disconnection, and reduction to the materials and the very nature of our work. At moments, we may remember the modernist call for honesty and truth to materials, and have a certain longing or nostalgia for a time of greater certainty, when it seemed possible to talk more meaningfully about truth in architecture. Modernism was a singular project, an incisive instrument for dealing with our world, cutting cleanly through our social and environmental challenges with unquestionable confidence. The key instrument to this modernism was scientific knowledge. Through it, we were liberated from myth and religion for a true and reliable path towards human emancipation and enlightenment. The knowledge was real, it was exciting, and it delivered. We developed enormous capability and capacity for controlling our environment, our health, and social evolution. Through technology and a scientific understanding of the natural world, it gave certainty, direction, unity, and a dazzling potential. It was progress, not just in terms of technical development and evolution, but as a noun with a capital P. In progress, we had something to believe in, a truth we could count on. But it had a flip side, a blindness that became something of a betrayal of the Enlightenment vision of modern project. The singular truth of modernism and the march of progress became intolerant, with cultural and ethnic diversity, inclusion, and equity trampled underfoot. Enabled through scientific and technological advancements, the 20th century witnessed an unleashing of human suffering and environmental degradation on a breathtaking scale. It was a century of such astounding progress that it almost killed us all. Architecture, likewise intoxicated with the confidence of truth, played its part in this human and environmental degradation. European cities and towns were twice damaged, first through the violence of the Second World War, and then through post-war urban reconstruction. International modernism became hegemonic, flattening cultural differentiation and human connections to the land, while undermining the environment and First Nations communities through ignorance and indifference. Architecture became primarily quantitative and measurable, a singular truth that ultimately left it robbed and soulless. Beware those who claim to possess the truth. We were naive, and the modernist truth was deeply ideological. Our connection with each other and with the world is infinitely more complex and culturally layered than the singularity of the modernist truth. But this late 20th century realization came too late. We were already almost entirely displaced, alienated and disconnected from alternative earthly truths, while the fragmented and marginalized social cultures that still retained pre-modern knowledge were fatally damaged and dispossessed. The postmodernism of the late 20th century pushed back hard, revealing the contingent and subjective nature of modern truth and the meta-narrative, uncovering its ideology and instrumental nature, and promoting more critical, broader, inclusive, and socially conditioned truths. Architecture was released from the tight, abstract constraints of modernism, set free to discover its past, turn to its traditions, and interdependence with a local culture of place. But once alienated, is such a return possible, or do we only further undermine through our thin, patronizing ignorance what we seek to reclaim? Something else had happened also, something sinister that undermined this turn and made it almost beside the point. Our noble project of knowledge and human emancipation enabled by scientific knowledge was Faustian and released something far more destructive than the power of our science and technology, a force that refuses to ever return to its Pandora's box and defies all attempts at control and mediation, and is now too deep within us to ever leave. Replacing myth, religion, ritual, continuity, and interconnected knowledge was not just scientific knowledge, but an insidious process that displaced all human values. the parasitic meta-ideology of commodification, an all-consuming valuelessness through which we are reduced from citizens to mere consumers, a seemingly harmless and useful process growing like a disease, whereby gradually everything we touch is reduced to a commodity, slowly infected and released and eased of meaning. Everything is a commodity. Every cultural movement, every art form and protest. Every resistance is recuperated into a system of valueless, meaningless exchange that feeds on itself. Enabled by our endlessly expanding technology, now even our very identity, we readily give up to commodification and seemingly happily collaborate with our own demise and disappearance. Social values themselves, progressive, good, and maybe even true, are now able to be immediately processed and diluted for ready commodification. Think of the artful and highly crafted Nike Colin Kaepernick advertising campaign of 2018, or the Gillette Toxic Masculinity campaign of 2019 that commodified progressive social values against oppressive social norms. Notwithstanding the worthiness of the social message, the process of recuperation of these value changes is exploitative and instrumental. What really is the interest of Nike and Gillette? Perhaps this accommodating commodification of values is the purest, cleanest, most subtle and most insidious evolutionary source of human coercion. A modernist obsession with asphyxiating truth, or a plurality of contingent self-serving truths, are questionable alternatives. But can architecture really say anything anyway, let alone concern itself with the truth? Is architecture ultimately only about itself, and therefore open to multiple interpretations and representations as it is uses? Is architecture silent to questions of truth? The adaptation and reuse of architecture for seemingly contradictory representations throughout history would seem to support this. From the Roman pagan basilicas adapted for Christian churches, through to the endless classical colonnades and porticos for fascist representations of power and oppression, or monuments to democracy and freedom. Architecture seems in many ways ultimately value-free and available for adaptation to any use or ideological application. Is architecture only ultimately about itself? Is it entirely autonomous? And is there perhaps within its silence some kind of truth? Is it through autonomy and independence that architecture might speak? Through a self-referential architecture that draws on its own history, there is a possible separation that allows architectural form to be distanced from function, political and technological drivers. An architecture founded on a universal human project composed from its typological and classical history. This autonomy and distancing are not necessarily neutral, but also potentially critical. Perhaps this was the remarkable ambition in the distilled work of Aldo Rossi, text, drawing, and an architecture of the city of singular purpose, a true silence that allows architecture to stand apart and speak. Classical architecture, through thousands of years of adaptation and intergenerational reuse, has been largely washed clean of ideological associations and can be seen as universal and fundamental in its elements and composition, a human universality that allows it to be autonomous and self-referential. But such independence and transparency to ideology is Eurocentric and difficult to accept. Surely such adaptable classical modernist form is nothing but a representation of extreme oppression to First Nations cultures that have suffered violence, invasion, and colonial settlement. Architecture cannot be entirely autonomous. It cannot be immune or completely indifferent to the functions and uses it accommodates, nor the political and ideological intentions behind its design. We confer meaning on architecture through our intentions, our presence, our use, and our ceremonies. Architecture is not entirely neutral to the human lives within it. It is marked by them and comes to embody the memory of these human lives and events, both the celebrations and achievements, but also the pain and scars of our deeds. They become embedded in the space and the fabric of architecture. We have all felt this embodiment of life and deeds in spaces marked by great happiness, and perhaps more powerfully, in buildings that have witnessed and supported human suffering and pain. Architecture cannot be innocent of the deeds it has accommodated or the intentions for which it was constructed. It surely shares the guilt, and we can feel it in the walls, the windows, and the doors that have closed on such suffering. Architecture will hold memory of the intention behind its design and the witnessing of events for generations, both good and bad. Perhaps this is why some buildings must be retained and preserved, while others must be destroyed and erased. Beyond such masks of memory, can architecture actually say anything, true or false? Despite many suggestions otherwise, architecture is not really a language and does not speak truth and falsehood like language, nor is it entirely mute. Architecture can perhaps speak non-propositional truths, truths that are beyond words and speak more directly to us and within us. Architecture does this through experience relating to almost all of our senses, associations, and memories. Architecture can figure and frame our experience of the world, reset and reorientate us. Architecture can make us see and feel the truth of the world through waking us from our slumber, through inspiring us, confronting us, reassuring us, wrapping arms around us, or turning us out to face the world. Architecture does not tell these truths through some scenographic mask indifferent to the materials and nature of its making, nor by merely transparently reflecting the reality of its structure and construction. Architecture can explain the nature of its making, its assembly, a tectonic composition, and then bend this representation of poetic intent. Weight can be made weightless, enclosure made open, solidity made transparent. Architecture tells its truth through lies, distortions of construction for formal purpose, lies that help us glimpse the truth about the world and our place within it. Architecture gives us an experience that distills our consciousness, concentrates our senses and perceptions to our interrelationship with each other and our world. We can be slightly changed through this experience, perhaps see the world slightly differently, perhaps feel the truth of our interrelationship with the world around us, and maybe even begin to reconcile our place in it. We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth, at least the truth that is given to us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of their lies. Pablo Capasso. Thank you.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for a searingly honest, if melancholic, talk. And I think it's very interesting to speculate on the interrelationship between melancholy and honesty in this sense. And I could immediately think of two, one very glib and one slightly less glib points where that might be true. One is that being truthful, as I think you are, many of your perceptions, I think, would be resonant with many people here, it is to induce a state of melancholy, almost inevitably. But the other, perhaps a little bit less glib, is that when you're talking about modernism as being a Faustian pact, which is obviously, it's an idea that comes at least from Marshall Berman in the 1970s, and again, I think it has a lot of truth in it, Faust was depicted as a melancholic by Dürer and by Rembrandt. The point where melancholy was one of the humours that governed human behaviour, that Vasari alludes to, that people who have this humour of melancholy would be artistically capable, at least, and rarely do they fail. Well, I think that's a little bit optimistic, but so I think there are ways in which honesty and melancholy overlap. But I think some of your comments towards the end, that actually it's through lies that we can perceive the truth. It's through melancholy that we can perceive happiness, as you were alluding to, because melancholy is a composite emotion, as you alluded to by Italo Calvino. I think it's sadness that has got lightness,
yes,
or whatever the phrase was. So it's a composite emotion, and that through that it is constantly, there is a dynamic to it, which I think is itself quite interesting. It seems to me that through some sort of dynamic relationship moving forward, and forward, backward, sideways, or whatever, we can actually avoid the stasis of being trapped, as some of the buildings of which you are more critical, for example, the Auschwitz, is trapped in an incredibly negative worldview. I mean, that's a very generous way of putting it, but it didn't offer any way out, literally or metaphorically. Whereas if you think of being constantly in some sort of dialogue, there may be a way forward. It may be incredibly hard to find. It may even be impossible to find, but at least it allows us to retain an element of optimism.
That's right, Jeremy. And I think that's a good analysis of what I've been talking about. I think the thing about melancholy, and that I reflect on, is exactly that, is that it's a withdrawal, but not an entire descent. The state of depression is basically a one-way spiral down. Melancholy is more reflective, but it is a withdrawal of the self. And I think that it can actually be a energy-inducing state to put yourself in. And I think if we do reflect on the world with any sense of truth or authenticity, then it is hard not to see the challenges. So I think it's a very, and of course I wrote this over COVID when things were pretty bad. So there's obviously a relationship there. People think my book's a bit dark, but it's I think it's in that state that it's possible to actually see something perhaps a little bit deeper, and as you say, find a way through it.
Yeah, and even if that's just a temporary way through it. I mean, modernism temporarily brought a whole load of benefits to a whole load of people.
Yeah.
Yes, it passed on problems on the whole to other people in different parts of the world, but the world probably in some was a better place for us. And I'm not just talking about modern architecture, I'm talking about modern thought in general, and modern technical progress. But we know, not least the origins of COVID may well be because of advanced science rather than because of some naturally occurring condition. So, all these things are bound up with each other. It's like, the old style Protestant theology, which is really what Faust comes out of. You can't have evil without good. You can't have truth without lies. And you need to have that dialogue. And uncomfortable though it is, being uncomfortable is actually what architecture is about. And Mario Cucinella, who was speaking here just before you, said the condition, engineers deal with numbers and architects deal with anxiety. And I think that's a very good way of putting it. So I think we're going to have to come to a close, but we could obviously talk for a lot longer. Now, Richard's book is available. It's just outside, I think, and you're prepared to sign a few copies if anyone would like to buy one, and ask Richard to sign it. And I think, as I say, I haven't done much more than dip into it, but it's a fascinating exploration of architecture from an unusual perspective that you've brought to it. So thank you very much, Richard, for a talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.